All right, folks, as we get going today, what I wanted to do really is just take a few minutes to introduce the third learning module. And this is the one that's actually going to be dealing with American federalism. I've said as I began to introduce the course in Blackboard that sometimes people really don't like this idea of federalism. Number one, because they think it's boring. And number two, because in fact, they're not really sure what it is. So, why don't we just start this by giving you a basic definition? Federalism. Federalism is really the idea that there are going to be multiple governments that are going to be ruling over you at the exact same time. Think about that for just a second. Multiple governments that are going to be ruling over you at exactly the same time. So let's put this into context. And here we are today. We're, dealing with a class from the Rockville campus. So I'm guessing that many of y'all will live in Rockville or maybe Gaithersburg. Well, that means that that local government, Rockville or Gaithersburg or whichever city it is that you actually live in, is going to have some jurisdiction over you. And of course, whether you live in Rockville or Gaithersburg or Germantown or TP or wherever, Wheaton, the idea is that you're also going to be living in Montgomery County. So not only is that local city township type government going to have some jurisdiction over you, but Montgomery County government is going to have some jurisdiction over you as well. And of course, Montgomery County is in the fine state of Maryland, and that means that Maryland government in Annapolis is going to have authority over you as well. And of course, Maryland is going to be in the United States, which means that the United States federal government is going to have jurisdiction. So when I give you the definition and I say that federalism is the idea that multiple governments are going to be ruling over you at the same time, well, that's where we're talking. You're talking about city or local type government. You're talking about county government. You're talking about state government, and you're talking about the United States federal government. Now, here's a question. And I want you to think about this in a somewhat logical way, hopefully. How many governments do you think that there are in the United States? I mean, if you added up all of these governments, how many would it be? Well, oftentimes people will say, well, there's one government and that's the federal government. And that's true, but there's a lot more than just the federal government. Sometimes people will say that there are 50 state governments plus one federal government. Sometimes people will just say there are only three levels of government, and that's state, local, and federal. And there is some truth to that, but I wanted to get a little bit more specific. And that's actually where we're going to start getting here into letter B under Roman numeral 1. And that is the idea that, believe it or not, there's roughly about 90,000 governments. If you added up the federal government and all of the states and all of the counties and then the townships and the cities, if you added up things like school boards that in fact you get to vote on, believe it or not, it adds up to almost 90,000. So this chapter title, if you will, at least this first section, Federalism is Boring, Not. Well, part of the trick with this is we got to figure out which governments are going to have jurisdiction over you or over I or over us. And we're also going to have to figure out what kinds of powers that they have, because let's be honest, the federal government is supposed to be a government of limited powers. The state governments are probably supposed to have a little bit more power than the federal government, but that may not be the way that it works out. And let's face it even further, the county and city local type governments are actually going to be exercising an awful lot of state laws, which means they could actually exercise them a little bit differently. So when you put this all into context, federalism can be tricky because, again, you're going to have local, county, state, and federal governments that are going to be ruling over you all at the same time. Now, let me stress, I'm not saying that all 90,000 of these governments are fighting to exercise jurisdiction over you. But the ones that deal with where you live or where your kids go to school, for example, well, they will actually be kind of competing. And sometimes it can get a little bit tricky. Now, under Roman numeral 2 up there, you'll notice this idea of benefits. And of course, Roman numeral 3 down there is going to be drawbacks. And the first benefit of this idea of federalism is the idea of experimentation. And I'll just go ahead and click on this and take you to the text. And as we get going on this, if you look back in terms of history, believe it or not, it was the Supreme Court that did an awful lot in terms of actually I guess, defining what the federal government's powers were going to be, but just as importantly, what the limits on the federal government's powers were going to be. And you'll notice here, just in this second line under the benefits of federalism, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis observed in 1932 that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. Now, think about that. This is where the slogan, states are laboratories of democracy, comes from. Because, again, states have the ability to ultimately be able to experiment with the policies that they want to try and implement. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. And we just passed the 100-year anniversary on this. But do you know the first state that actually gave women the right to vote? Think about that for just a second, because it really might surprise you. And honestly, I'm not even going to lie to you about this. I didn't know the first state that, in fact, gave women the right to vote until I went to graduate school out in Wyoming. Wyoming is known as the equality state. And they got this moniker in part because Wyoming was the first state that gave women the right to vote. Ladies and gentlemen, think about this for just a second. Wyoming had given women the right to vote before they became a state. And then they applied for statehood. And there was a sense, hey, wait a minute. We don't need women voting. We don't need Wyoming being a state if they're giving women the right to vote. Women voting, what do they need to be voting for? Well, Wyoming stuck to its principles on this. And believe it or not, this is the exact kind of social experiment, if you will, that in fact led to women gaining the right to vote in all of the states in the United States. In fact, that being a constitutional amendment. Think about it in some other ways. Do you know which state, and this is something that will be relevant to many of you, do you know which state actually first gave women the right to vote, 18-year-olds the right to vote? This is one that you don't always think about, but it was Georgia. And again, Georgia, a daring social experiment, you could argue, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote. Well, we'll understand on this. That also became a constitutional amendment. 18-year-olds can vote in all the states in the country. So I throw this out to you because understand, under this idea of experimentation, and you notice this little picture over here with the laboratory scientists, if you will, mixing and concocting policies, you might say. Well, if you have an experiment that works, odds are not only are other states going to copy it and begin to implement it, but there's a chance that it could become federal law. Now, let me give you another example. Nevada is a state that has legalized prostitution. That's also, to be fair, a social experiment. But that's not a social experiment that took off around the country. So you can experiment and you can try things, and maybe they're going to work very, very well, and they can become national policy. You can experiment and you can try things. And if it doesn't work, well, the nice thing about this is that the mistake maybe that you made in trying this policy only impacts your state, but it doesn't impact the other 49. And then, of course, you can try social experiments, maybe that have no hope of ever becoming national, but the fact is that they can add to the distinctiveness, the flavor, that social experimentation, if you will, of what your own state actually is. So Wyoming, Georgia, Nevada, all three of these states in some ways really deal with this experimentation. Now, when we begin the discussion piece on this, what we're going to begin to talk about is Oklahoma, a number of years ago, had a very unique abortion law where, in fact, if you wanted to get an abortion, you were required to look at an ultrasound of the fetus. Now, they had their reasons for this, which we'll talk about, and maybe you would be in favor of that. But inevitably, there are also some people that are very outspoken against the idea that you'd have to look at this ultrasound. And to be sure, we're going to talk about that. Maybe that law would work in Oklahoma or a more conservative state. Maybe it wouldn't here in Maryland. Well, it kind of stands to reason that if you're a woman and you want an abortion, you should be treated the same wherever you are. So should Oklahoma's law win, or should maybe a law that would be more protective of the right to choose, maybe in a state like Maryland or New York, should that be the way that we go? New York has had a very controversial policy that's known as stop and frisk. And we're going to talk about this because some of you may actually have been subject to stop and frisk. The idea that the police can, quote unquote, randomly come up to you, stop you, and frisk you for illegal contraband. We're going to talk about this policy in New York because the police actually pulled a whale of a lot of weapons off the street. Maybe you could argue the crime rate dropped, and maybe you could argue that the city as a whole was safer because of this. However, they focused the vast bulk of their random quote unquote searches on people that were Black and Hispanic, actually particularly Black and Hispanic males. So maybe this made the city safer, or maybe this is a really blatant example of discrimination. That's what we're going to talk about. And then, of course, this third one up here, maybe you've heard about United States versus Arizona. This was actually the papers, please case. The idea whether or not the Arizona police, if they suspected somebody was illegally in the country, could actually require documentation demonstrating that the person was legally there. And as you might would imagine, this is something that really could have a significant impact on criminal justice and undocumented immigration. It could also be a very racist and discriminatory policy. We're going to talk about which direction that you would go there. Now, as I close out in this introduction dealing with benefits, you also notice down there that there's this idea of opportunity and there's this idea of access. You know, we've already talked in previous chapters, and I asked y'all how many of you thought you might run for office or you might be interested in becoming a politician one day. And inevitably, the numbers are terribly, terribly low. Maybe some of y'all have got good judgment already. Maybe y'all have some misconceptions, but the point is, it's pretty low. Federalism, though, is uniquely catered to give people the opportunity to be able to serve in government in the capacity that they choose. So let's think about this in a couple of ways. You know, I remember as a little kid, I used to think I was going to be president of the United States. I don't know why I thought that. I don't know what made me think that. And I don't think that's ever going to happen. But the idea is that if you wanted to really make politics your life and maybe serve in a nationwide office like the presidency, or a very significant federal office like the United States Senate or the House of Representatives, or maybe you wanted to be the governor of the fine state of Maryland, well, the idea is that you've got the opportunity to be able to do that. Maybe some of you don't really want to commit your life to politics like that, but maybe you do want to serve. You know, think about this. The Maryland State Legislature, the General Assembly, only serves in Annapolis about 90 days a year in a typical year. So when you put that into context, you could be a part-time legislator. You could also maintain other part-time commitments employment-wise, maybe even depending upon your job, some full-time commitments employment-wise. And you would also really maybe be able to sleep at home every night, even if you were working in Annapolis. Some folks are going to be very, very comfortable with that. Maybe some of you might be interested in serving in the county council, or maybe as the mayor of your hometown. I mean, if you think about you know, being able to drive to Annapolis, that might be an hour or hour and a half, hour 45, depending upon traffic every day. That could be pretty hard. But if you're just in Montgomery County trying to get to the county seat in Rockville, you know, to be able to serve as a mayor, or for that matter, in the county council, maybe that drive isn't that far. And maybe that's not even a drive, but a walk. Some people might be very interested in that. And then, of course, maybe some of you have kids or plan to have kids, and you don't want to deal with everything in the world, but maybe you just want to make sure that you can serve in a capacity to make your children's schools the best that they can be. Again, something as simple as a Board of Education would be, again, this opportunity. So you could go as far as you chose, or you could keep things as limited as you wanted, but you would have the opportunity to be able to serve in a local capacity, state capacity, or federal capacity. Put this in another context and talking about access. This isn't really dealing with the idea of running for office, y'all, but rather this is the idea of having access to elected officials. And again, I'll throw this out. Here we are in Rockville. This is a Rockville-based class. I typically will have students meet with the mayor during the course of the semester. Not every class, to be sure, but several of them. And I will typically walk down to the mayor's office from campus, sometimes with students, and we'll just have a nice conversation. It's about a 15-20 minute walk. I say that to you because you're 15 or 20 minutes walking from campus to the mayor's office. And when you consider that the Montgomery County Council office is right across the street, that means that you're about a 20-minute walk away from being able to maybe meet with a county council member. You have access at the local level. Again, Annapolis from Rockville is maybe an hour and a half away, again, depending upon traffic. It's not crazy that if you wanted to go out there and meet with the state legislator, you could do that. It's also not crazy that you could intern with the state legislature. And not only can we get you pointed in that direction, but we may be able to work it out and turn it into college credit. I say that to you because these are, again, examples of this idea of access. And, maybe we're blessed, maybe not, but understand, living here in the fine state of Maryland, we can take a train, the metro, down to DC, and we can be, right outside of the House of Representatives, the United States Senate, the White House, the Supreme Court, in a little bit more than probably an hour once we go through security. Again, this is access. So if you've got a problem, you've got multiple levels where you can go. And again, living here in Maryland, the beauty of this is that all of these are within walking distance or a fairly short ride away. Again, federalism is the idea that multiple levels of government are going to be ruling over you at the same time. And this allows for states to be able to experiment with policies in their laboratories of democracy, if you will, that will allow them to, ultimately impact their state, but maybe policies that could impact the entire country. There is this idea of opportunity to be able to run. So you could live it or live your life and serve in politics as much or as little as you choose. And then, of course, there's the idea of access. Maybe you don't want to dirty your hands with the day-to-day of politics, but it's not crazy to send an email or to schedule a visit because there is access to, at least in Maryland anyway, these elected officials / politicians really within about an hour or an hour and a half away, just about in any level direction that you want to go. Let's stop there and we'll get into some of the drawbacks in just a minute.